We are finishing up a three-part series called The Gift of Encouragement. We have been looking at the life of Barnabas in the book of Acts, just three snapshots. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the very beginning of Barnabas' career in the book of Acts, and we saw how Barnabas is a champion for others. Last week, we looked at Acts chapter 9 and how Barnabas arrived just in time to the church in Antioch and how he offered encouragement when it was really needed. And this week we'll be moving forward to Acts chapter 15. So you could, if you have a Bible, you could open and turn there. One more note. So Tuesday, as you heard, we're going to be having dinner with our friends from the mosque. We, again, would love to have you come out for that. And then on Wednesday, our youth group is going to be doing an outreach project with the youth from the mosque. So our youth and their youth are going to get together and make some meals and put together hygiene kits and take those down to folks who live outside downtown. And so we're pretty excited just to have an opportunity not only to eat together, but to work together a little bit in our city with our Muslim neighbors, which I think is a great witness to the bridge building heart of our Lord. And I hope you guys all have Thanksgiving plans. Some of us do. For some of us, Thanksgiving can be, well, for some it's a time of family gathering, and for some it's a time of aware that we don't have the kind of family that we maybe always wanted. And so this is a week to just connect with people. If you're with family, great. If you're not, I hope that you can connect with some people and you'll just sense the Lord's sustaining support in that. I want to start with a brief story. Churches can be pretty weird, can't they? Yes? Yes? No disagreement? Churches can be weird? Yes? I grew up in a church where it's very formal. Ties were sort of the norm. Not quite required. It wasn't tie required, but definitely the norm. Some of you, I've said before, I ended up running away from God, checked out of faith altogether. But once when I was in high school, I went to church with a friend, and at that church, if the church I went to was kind of upper middle class power formal, that's how I would describe it, upper middle, like dressed to impress formal. This was like old-fashioned formal. And I remember that there were women, actually almost all the women had hats, and a lot of the hats had like the lace pieces in front of them that hang there. Have you seen those hats with lace? And I thought it was just bizarre. When I went, I thought, where would you even get hats like everybody? Like I missed the cue. I didn't know, it was all like, I felt like I went to a museum or a historical play or something. And just I couldn't have felt more out of place. And then the message that morning, I will never forget, was on why rock and roll is satanic. And so that was the whole message. And quick, brief pause. Some of you, there's been one of the blessings of Facebook is that on Facebook, pictures never die. They just stay there. They live forever. They can come back from the dead. So I'm very grateful to my wife for posting this picture years ago, which has come back alive this week. This is a blast from the past. Okay, I'm going to go. I need prayer as a result of that picture. I'm getting comments all week about that picture. But my hair was super long when I went. So when I actually went to this church, I was the only one the only male with really long hair. And I felt like as I listened to this sermon, like I'm actually the only one in the whole church who listens to rock and roll. It was like the whole message was aimed at me or something. And it had, I don't know if you guys have heard of backmasking. There was this theory for a while that rock and roll records, if you played them backwards, had messages about Satan. And I just thought it was so crazy. And it drove me crazy. Well, years later, as I came back to the Lord, as I really gave my heart to Jesus, one of the very first times I had an honest prayer time. I don't know if you remember. So, if you can just think about, when there was a time very early on when I had an honest prayer time, I was alone in my apartment, sort of a crash pad with a bunch of college roommates, we lived together, but I was alone that evening and just had the God, what do you want from me or for me? Here I am, God, kind of prayer. Here I am. I'm going to try prayer. I've heard people pray for real. I had prayed a lot at meals with family, but I hadn't really honestly said, here I am, Jesus. And so I just very simply said something like that. Here I am. What do you want for my life? And the thing I remember just that night, the Lord saying to me is, I want you to get rid of all of your music. And I had a lot of music. I was like, It seemed like God was asking me to cut off a limb. And this is not going to be a message this morning about why rock and roll music is from Satan. I assure you of that. But it was a moment of the Lord pressing on something in my life that had pulled me away. And in the midst of it, I was left thinking about, what is the core of the gospel, you know? I had always been really turned off by the things the church added to the gospel. And I was starting to sort out, what does the gospel mean for me? As we step into Acts 15, we're going to step into the main chapter in many ways, the central, pivotal chapter of the book. And it's about a really messy situation where they're sorting through what's the heart of the gospel. Paul and Barnabas had been in Antioch, and miracles had been happening, and many people had been coming to faith. And then some other folks we'll read about came and wanted to add another requirement. And it threw people off the track. And we're going to look at Barnabas, who along the way has consistently been an encourager. And we're going to look at a different wrinkle of what it means to be an encourager this morning. And as we've walked through this series, I've not only hoped that God would encourage us as a church, but also that God would position us not to neglect the power of encouragement. We've seen that encouragement can change lives forever. We've seen that when encouraging a friend can transform a life. Encouraging a neighbor can change someone's trajectory in an incredibly life-giving way. And this morning we're going to look at really the strength of character that it takes at times to be an encourager. So let's pray and look at Acts chapter 15 together. Lord, thanks for your word. And I ask that you would this morning just pour out your Spirit as we read your word. I ask that you would speak to our hearts as well as our minds. Lord, I ask that you would shape our character to be like yours. And would you love us in the deep places of our hearts? In your name, Jesus. Amen. So, jumping forward to Acts 15, certain individuals came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into a sharp dispute and debate with them. Brief 30-second Greek moment. The sharp dispute word is also the word for riot. It's literally no small riot, and debate happened. So there's like an uproar. You can picture like really heated conversation. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed along with some others to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, so they're going south from Antioch, which is in the southeast corner of Turkey, down towards Jerusalem, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. This news made all of the believers very glad. And when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. So here's the scene. We have been talking about how Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch. They stayed there for a year, and miracles happened. People are healed. Many people come to faith. There's what we might call a revival. The folks who had been persecuted in Jerusalem got there, and there's just an explosion of faith in Antioch. And then a group comes from Jerusalem saying, wait a minute, you have to be circumcised if you're going to be saved at all. They build a fence. That's a requirement, and Paul and Barnabas push back. They take a stand. They hold on to their convictions. And an argument erupts, and they eventually go back to Jerusalem to settle the matter. And we'll read later this morning how that all winds up. But a third practice of Barnabas coming out of this passage. So the first practice was that Barnabas champions others. If we want to operate in the gift of encouragement, we want to be a church and individuals that champion others. The second one was that Barnabas offers encouragement when it's needed most. We want to be aware of when people around us are between a rock and a hard place and able to speak like an on-time message of encouragement. But the third one is that Barnabas holds on to convictions. He holds on to his convictions. When opposition comes, he doesn't fold, he doesn't fade away. He pushes back, he gets into a dispute. He says, wait a minute, it's not true that you have to be circumcised in order to be saved. And the reality is, if Barnabas had folded, if Barnabas had gone with the flow, if Barnabas had said, you know what, that's what they're saying, let's just go with it, he would have undercut all the people he'd been encouraging for a year. He would have undercut all the foundation. In order to maintain his posture of encouragement, he had to take a stand. And these days, I think that, taking a stand is not popular, is it? Convictions are not popular. We live in a tolerant, live and let live, very politically correct culture, don't we? Just last month, the Barna organization, in partnership with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, did a national survey of millennials. And they divided it into a survey of millennials, so like under 30, you can think 20-somethings, millennials who identify as Christians and millennials who don't identify as Christians. And one of the sections of the survey was for millennials who don't identify as Christians, what do they think when they see a person reading a Bible in a public place? Which I thought, no, it's interesting. I wonder what they'll say. What do millennials think when they see a person reading the Bible? Well, the number one answer, the top answer, was they think that person's politically conservative, right? Naturally, it's a Republican book, and so, if you're reading a Bible, then that probably means that you're publicly Republican. Like, that's just what it means. The second most common answer, though, was interesting to me. 27% of millennials believe that the Bible is a dangerous book primarily used to oppress people. And so they see it as a deliberately provocative act. It's interesting. I thought that's a change in our culture. That for young people who are not Christian, many of them see even just reading the Bible as provocative, like you're trying to provoke me. And then another group, 20% or so, said they just think the Bible's irrelevant, it doesn't matter. But the interesting thing is the shift to where even reading a book with a reputation for convictions becomes something our culture around us can be pushing back on. And I say that to say that if we're going to hold on to our convictions, it's certainly going to take character. It's going to take something deep within us. And Barnabas specifically, key insight here is he's committed to the message of grace. The conviction he's holding on to is not like a judgmental conviction, actually. Barnabas is not holding on to a self-righteous conviction that he's better than other people or some things that are, maybe oftentimes stereotyped towards followers of Jesus. Barnabas is holding on to a conviction that we're saved because God has come after us. We're saved because God is, number one, sent his only son to die on a cross for us, but that God is sweeping in people into his kingdom, that the kingdom is breaking into this world, that it's not about the hoops we jump through. That's what Barnabas is holding on to. That's what he's contending for. He's saying that, it's not okay to say that you have to be circumcised because that's actually not true. And I want to walk through this passage and look at how to hold on to convictions well, because I think we can all think of pictures of holding on to convictions poorly. We can think of pictures of where holding on to convictions and self-righteousness seem like almost flip sides of the same coin. Like, if I take a stand, do I have to be that guy or that woman? Do I have to be the one who's like the self-righteous Christian? Is that the only option? Is it like self-righteousness or just under the radar? It's like those are the two options for Christian life, right? I can just not say anything, or I can appear like the judgmental person. But actually, Barnabas shows us a different way. And I think we desperately need followers of Jesus in our city who hold on to the core things of the gospel, who are willing to be authentic in them, who don't just get shoved under the rug, but also who do it with a tremendous grace and winsomeness. So let's walk through this. How can we hold on to convictions well? Well, the first thing is that we do have to be willing to engage in conflict. I think that if we want to follow Jesus, we cannot be conflict averse to a fault. And I know in myself, I don't like conflict. I know why also, because I have also gone to therapy like Jenny. And I can just think of all the times I've gone to a restaurant and my mom has said, we're not sitting in this seat and we want a better table. And no, why would you, send the food back, send it back again, send it back again. It's not perfect. And so I just made an internal commitment as a teenager. I will never have conflict in public again in my life. Michelle jokes that when they bring me a wrong size shoes, I just say thank you and buy them. It's okay. I don't need the right size. They have other people to serve. I'll just take the wrong size. It's not all that bad, but I don't like conflict. But following Jesus may bring us into some healthy conflict inside and outside of the church. And actually, we desperately need people who are willing to hold on to convictions. Some of you know I've been on a little bit of maybe a weirdo 19th century history kick, just discovering the real treasures of the faith in the 19th century. Here's the family of John Rankin and his wife Jean. They're in the middle. They have 9 sons and 4 daughters, family of 13. John was born in Tennessee, and he was born just before 1800. Presbyterian family, growing up, and there were 2 formative events while he was a teenager. One was the Second Great Awakening swept his part of Tennessee. And all of a sudden, at these camp meetings, the Spirit of God was poured out, and his life was seized by spiritual passion. The second thing that happened was there was a slave uprising right by where he lived. And his mom told him that she thought slavery was wrong, which, for Tennessee white folks in 1795 was not the cultural norm, right? Well, over time, as he grew, he really started to believe that one of the serious problems in the culture was slavery. He started writing letters to his brothers about slavery, and some of those letters got published. And he started to get a reputation as a guy who was eloquently opposing slavery. He felt called into ministry, and he started to pastor a little church in southern Kentucky. And one of his very first messages, he preached a message against slavery and said, I think slavery is wrong. Well, you might imagine that didn't go over super well in southern Kentucky. And so they not only fired him, but they told him he needed to leave the town immediately. So he left town, and he started. It was illegal to teach slaves to read or write, so he started oral instruction. He started schools, well, initially a class, but quickly schools, to instruct slaves. And again, there was a lot of pushback from the surrounding towns, and somewhat famously, he and his wife and their kids at the time had to flee in the middle of the night across the Ohio River when a mob came for them. And for their next house, they looked for a place on the Ohio River, on the Ohio side, that would be high enough up on a hill where it could be seen easily for the river. So in case that any escaped slaves came up, they might be able to give them refuge. And they found a house up on a hill 450 feet above the river, and eventually they cut stairs down to the river. And by the time his kids grew up, everybody in this picture became active in the abolitionist movement. And in his own words, his faster kids became runners who would go upstream and downstream, letting people know when either a slave was coming or when another house would need it further up the stream. And his 2 most eloquent sons became speakers, kind of going up and down the Ohio Valley, advocating for abolition. And they cooked almost around the clock. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, stayed in his house, and the stories that formed that book came from her stay in his house. He had a candle that they would put in the window when they knew a slave was coming, and they told him, as you go up the river, at night, you look for the candle, and when they saw a single candle high on a hill and found the steps cut in the hill, they knew that that house would have safe refuge, would have food, and would have a place to another. That was one of the first and sort of the primary hub of the Underground Railroad. Eventually the Presbyterians, sort of the group he was with, had had enough of the rumors and kicked him out of the denomination, and he started a breakaway group that eventually grew to scores of churches that were all opposed to slavery. Check this out. When the Civil War ends, Henry Ward Beecher, not to be confused with Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was another famous abolitionist, said, "How is it that the institution of slavery came down in the United States?" And he answered the question this way: John Rankin and his family brought it down. And there's more to the story, but scholars estimate that perhaps a majority of all the fugitive slaves who found freedom in the 4 decades before the Civil War stayed in that house. Thousands and thousands of people stayed in that one house and then went to a system. But it was one family on the Ohio Valley who held to their convictions, who realized this is not the gospel, who lived it out, and who lived it out for 4 decades. There was a bounty on him for 20 years. And he held to his conviction, and as a result, thousands of people were able to find freedom through that home. Well, I say that to say that convictions can be a great thing. Holding on to convictions can be a great thing. I mean, in a very small way. Next week as we, do cards from Love 146, like that's a small legacy of the Rankin family and others. We want to just, oppose slavery. Bridge of Hope, just in small ways. What would it mean if, as a church, if we held on to convictions about grace and freedom? What can one family do in a culture with tons of broken things? Well, the answer is a family can actually change a culture with tons of broken things if together you hold on to convictions. What can one single professional woman do? Well, you could look at the story of Pandita Rumambai. That's just a name if you want to write it down. Indian woman who just hugely changed education in India. Just a single professional woman with a phenomenal gift for memorizing Sanskrit. The answer is, with some vision from the Lord and some character to hold on to convictions, wonderful things. Okay. Second, pursue a process of resolution. Barnabas does not just say, I'm right, you're wrong, end of story, let's move on. He does not just say, you're wrong about circumcision, sorry. He's willing to pursue a process. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem. That's 260 miles from Antioch. Okay, I just looked this up in case you want to reference. San Luis Obispo is 260 miles from where we are. So that's like a group of us just walking to San Luis Obispo in order to resolve the problem at hand. No kayak, no Airbnb, no go online. You don't get to Google like cheapest flight. They went by foot. And it would have taken weeks, maybe a couple of months to make that journey. That's a commitment to the process, isn't it? That's a lot more than, hey, I disagree with you, let's have coffee and talk again, I still disagree with you. That's a commitment to a process. I think a lot of times when we hold on to our convictions, we're not willing to walk in a relationship where there's tension. And Barnabas goes down probably with the people he disagreed with to Jerusalem so they can all solve the problem in community. That's a tremendous commitment to process. I had a conversation this week with someone who was really struggling with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and kind of the anti-theist movement right now. And I feel like every month or 2 or 3, I have a conversation with someone who's run into Dawkins or Hitchens on YouTube or in a book and is just battling through questions. Science, Bible, evolution, Bible, origins, Bible. How do we hold this together? And something I've learned in those conversations, and maybe you've had those conversations, and maybe you're in those, maybe they're very personal right now. Something I've learned is that there's always heart issues underneath the head issue. It's never just about the head issue. It's never just about dating in Genesis chapter 1. It's about issues of the heart. And something I've learned is that if we want to walk in conversations like that, it's always going to be a journey. It's about life and deep heart issues. If we want to walk with a coworker, if you are a follower of Jesus and you want to walk with a coworker who's like, get over it, read Dawkins, get over it, It's a crutch, just get over faith. I think it's more than just turning up the worship volume in our cubicle and saying, nope, I'm right, you're wrong, It's more than putting a cross up, and it's walking in a process. It's walking relationally, which is what Barnabas does. So we want to be a community that's willing to walk in a process of resolution. Number 3, we want to rely on what God has done. This is jumping down just a little bit. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. And then in verse 12, the whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul. And again, note that Barnabas is first, telling about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. And wonders is like when you're awestruck, when you're thunderstruck, when you're speechless because of the astounding thing that just happened in front of you. That's a wonder. God's been doing wonders among us. And the whole group got quiet. Now, that verse is remarkable to me because Paul wrote the book of Galatians, which is this extended argument about, among other things, circumcision and obeying the law, right? But that's not what they relied on. What they relied on is stories about what God had done. I think Paul and Barnabas could have said, hey, you guys insisting on circumcision, you're missing Torah. You're missing the whole point. Abraham was a wandering Aramaean. He was just a polytheistic pagan when God spoke to him in the middle of the night and said, look up at the sky, see if you can count the stars. I'm going to make you more plentiful than the stars in the sky. I'm going to bless you and I'm going to make you a blessing. It had nothing to do with whether or not Abraham was circumcised. It had everything to do with God's sovereign grace snatching him and wanting to build a people through him. Barnabas could have brought up Moses and said Moses was a murderer and a refugee in hiding when God showed up and said, I have heard the cries of my people. Now go to Egypt, go to Pharaoh, and set my people free so that they can worship me. Had nothing to do with Moses following the law. It had everything to do with God reaching out, wanting to graciously and sovereignly raise up a people. So they rely on what God's done. They tell stories of what God has done. And it says, in verse 4, everybody was filled with joy as they're traveling down through Phoenicia. People are filled with joy. When we hear stories, last night I heard a story from a student that goes to Coast about how, we were just talking about, when did you come to believe that God's Spirit's really active in the world? And he said, when I was 6 years old, my mom was pregnant and she was dying of thyroid cancer. They gave her no chance to live, and some Christians came and prayed, and the doctors checking the cancer the next morning found she was cancer-free. And I've always believed God was active since then. That will change your paradigm as a kid, won't it? That will just change your whole world. That will change your perspective. We want to rely on what God has done. And then the last one, have the humility. This is not easy either. Have the humility to submit to authority. Paul and Barnabas are willing to take it to the community. When they come down and they say, here's what God's done, and the Pharisees say their part, and Peter talks about how he's seen God moving among the Gentiles. And then James, later on in Acts chapter 15, speaks up. Here's what it says. When they finished, James spoke up. It's my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. I love that. Let's be a church that doesn't make it difficult for the pagans in our city. Let's just not make it hard. It's amazing how hard, Christians can make it to follow Jesus, right? Sometimes we make it harder than it needs to be. Let's not make it difficult, but he does have some things. Instead, let's write to them telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols. So let's tell them you should not worship idols. Let's tell them to abstain from sexual immorality. You should not do that. You should honor God with your bodies. And then let's tell them to avoid meat of strangled animals, which was sort of like, if you didn't read the first one, read it again. Like, watch out for idols because they're very bad for you. Let's tell them not to worship idols. We want to have the humility to, when we're holding on to our convictions, to test it with others. I think it's dangerous to be a lone ranger in our convictions. I think we want to be a community where we can trust that, the Lord together, when we're having tension, trust that the Lord will speak to us together and help us along. I want to finish with one more story because I think that, God is really active right now. He's drawing people into his kingdom, and we want to encourage them with everything we have. I was just talking to a friend named Mike. He's a pastor in Anaheim, and he just told me a story about how he, just a few weeks ago, they have a Seek class, midweek thing where people can come and learn about following Jesus. He was getting ready for the class, and they were about to have food. So just right before the class, someone walked in and brought in a business card and walked right up to him, and they have little church business cards with their service times and sometimes a picture of a pastor on staff, and his picture was on the card, and he said, "Is this you?" And Mike looked at it, and was like, "Yep, that is me, that's me." He said, "Can I tell you a story?" And Mike said he thought to himself, well, as long as it's 30 seconds, you can tell me a story. You ever been in one of those situations where someone wants to talk, and you're like, even if this is a good story, it needs to be a 30-second good story. So the guy says, I woke up from a nap this afternoon and just on a couch in a trailer park. There's a trailer park right next to the church. Woke up from a nap, looked on the ground, and there was his business card on the ground. And I thought it was, unusual. Looked at it, didn't recognize it, threw it away. So he went and sat down to get some food, and as he sat down, the same business card was right on the table. And he asked his brother, "Hey, did you put this here? Is this a joke?" His brother said, No, I didn't put that there. Same business card. He thought, that's pretty unusual. And this kid's name is Sal, Latino kid, no church background at all. In fact, he would later ask, what's a service? Why does it say 9 o'clock service? Like, what does that mean? What is a service? If you haven't heard that word, it's way of phrasing this. Good question. Anyway, threw it away. Leaves the trailer, heads out for the afternoon, opens his wallet, and the same card is in the wallet. He's like, something is happening. This is really weird. It's like, I need to go to this place. And so the third time he saw it, he looked at the address and realized it was nearby and walked over. Walked in, and Mike said, well, that is pretty amazing. And we're actually, just right now, we're going to start a class where we're just talking about getting to know God. You could join us. And Sal joined the class, and a few hours later committed his life to Jesus and is growing up now. He's a front row seat guy. That'll get your attention, won't it? That'll get your attention. But I say that because I really think that God is active out in front of us. God is active in our neighborhoods. God is active in our workplaces when we're not expecting it, when we don't see it, when we don't realize. God is reaching for people. And the people that God is reaching for need encouragement. They need a message of grace. They need people to stand with and by them. And we want to be a church that is ready to encourage, ready to hold on to convictions. But oftentimes that means like really grabbing onto and owning the message of grace in Jesus. Like I'm just going to hold on to that. I'm going to live that through and through. I'm going to be available, and I'm going to, in a certain sense, stand for that even when others might not be comfortable with that. And as we do that, we will have wonders to talk about. Let's all stand. Worship team, if you guys could come on up. We're going to close with a song of worship and then a time to get prayer if you'd like any prayer. So, Lord, I just ask right now that you would pour out your presence, Lord. We thank you that you're here, but Lord, would you just pour over us, Lord. Let's worship. Nope, you're still coming in. Just as we're about to start worship, I had a picture earlier I was asking the Lord about, and I feel like the Lord is maybe saying to one or two of us, I want you to fully commit. I want you to fully commit. If you've been toying with kind of a plan B, and you know the Lord is calling you to something, I think the Lord might be asking you to throw out the plan B. The Lord is wanting your whole heart. If you've been considering faith, in a few minutes there'll be a chance to pray with someone. Let's worship. Someone got on the prayer team earlier, just a person climbing up a mountain towards like a flag all alone, just a struggle, a lonely climb. It felt like it was for someone who feels like they're really struggling alone, and the Lord was saying, your struggle is my struggle. Your struggle is my struggle. If you feel like you are just battling towards something alone, we'd love to just pray for you. You can get prayer for anything you like this morning. If you're asking questions about God, we'd love to pray with you. Just ask God to show you himself. So prayer team, if you guys would want to come on up. There are some people on the prayer team. I see you. Let's hold hands across the aisles. We do this each week as a reminder that we're a community. We're a community learning to follow Jesus together. Lord, would you fill us with courage and strength to relentlessly hold on to grace and not to let it go. Lord, would you give us great joy and thanksgiving as we head into this week, Lord. You are a God who is good all the time. Lord, would you help us to trust you for the mysteries we don't understand. We love you, Jesus, and we go out in your name. Amen. God bless you guys. If you would like prayer, come on up. If you're headed out, have a great afternoon.